Welcome to part 2 of the uranium report for May 2022. Recently, Sprott Uranium Trust was rejected for listing at New York Stock Exchange. It is a setback, of course, but it is only a minor setback, as most investors can still invest in the Sprott Uranium Trust via the Canadian listing. And as history shows, a lot of investors actually do that. Sprott Uranium Trust, with its Canadian listing only, is showing very strong growth. For example, at the recent peak, the assets under management AUM were over $3 billion. And even now, the liquidity that Sprott Uranium Trust still has is around $1.75 billion. That's $1.75 billion in liquidity, which is a very bullish sign for the uranium prices, for the uranium industry, because with that much liquidity, Sprott Uranium Trust, at the current prices of, say, just above $50 per pound, Sprott Uranium Trust can still buy somewhere well over 30 million pounds of uranium with that much liquidity. So it is a relatively bullish sign, and Sprott does actually continue purchasing uranium. For example, in the first quarter of 2022, Sprott purchased 12.1 million pounds of uranium, removing that much uranium from the supply, which over the next perhaps a couple of years is going to be extremely bullish for uranium prices, as the inventories that the utilities have, the inventories that nuclear power generators have actually come down to around 2 years in Europe and already under 2 years in the US. So the stockpiles of uranium that generators have will only last them for under 2 years in the US. So as I have been mentioning for a while, the longer-term fundamentals for uranium are outstandingly promising, especially over the time frame of 2 to 3 years. Another bullish development in the uranium industry is what's actually happening in enrichment. Recently, enrichment started shifting from underfeeding to overfeeding. Let's actually have a look at the details of what happens to uranium as it moves from underground into those utilities. Uranium that is mined from underground is in the form of U3O6. For example, here on TradingView, we see futures prices for this U3O6, which then should be converted into UF6, which is used as feed in enrichment. It's enriched to contain more of the U235, uranium that is more prone to fission and generating energy. So what's happening right now is that the enrichment industry is now moving from underfeeding to overfeeding. And the reason for that is increased demand for enrichment. As utilities are running out of stockpiles of uranium, with greater demand for uranium, there is also greater demand for enrichment. But with fixed enrichment capacities, one way for enrichers to start producing more of the U235 rich uranium without simply spending more time on the enrichment process is to overfeed, to basically provide more of the feed of UF6 as inputs into the enrichment process to have greater enrichment for given capacity. So beyond all of the fundamentals that we have talked about before, such as removing the supply of uranium by the Sprott Uranium Trust and reducing stockpiles, inventories of uranium with the nuclear generators, which is also going to add more demand for uranium over the next 1 or 2 to 3 years. Now, an additional development that hasn't been really discussed much is a gradual shift by enrichment service providers from underfeeding to overfeeding, and that simply adds more to the demand for uranium, for UF6. And of course, going down the food chain, as recently as March this year, the demand for conversion has spiked by around 60%. So what we see is all along the supply chain, all along the uranium food chain, demand is actually growing. Looking at longer-term view, a while back, perhaps a decade ago, underfeeding of uranium using less than optimal amount of uranium in enrichment services was actually leaving as much as 20 million pounds of uranium back on the supply side. Over the years, back to last year, This extra supply has dropped from 20 million down to 7 million. At the moment, though, enrichers are switching from underfeeding to overfeeding, which perhaps over the next 1 or 2 years will add additional 5 to 10 million pounds in demand for uranium. So comparing with last year, that is actually a significant swing from additional 7 million towards the supply side to 5 to 10 million, say 8 million towards the demand side. That is a positive 15 million pounds swing. That is surely going to have a significant effect on uranium prices. Another important development over the longer term, over the next couple of years, is of course long-term contracts between the power generators and uranium producers. Recently though, so far in 2022, this long-term contracting has slowed down a little bit, and perhaps that's one of the other factors that has contributed to a relative weakness of uranium prices over the last few weeks. For example, so far this year, Cameco has only reported around 40 million pounds contracted. But there is a positive nuance to this slowdown in long-term contracting. Traditionally, the prices in these long-term contracts were tied to the market prices of uranium with a weight of 60% and were fixed with a weight of 40%. Currently, Cameco is actually pushing for more weight towards market prices. That is actually bullish coming from the producer of uranium, because it indicates that Cameco is quite confident in uranium prices going higher into the future. And on the buyer side, nuclear power generators, they are probably pushing back on this more market-oriented pricing in long-term contracts, at least at the moment. And that is one of those reasons for the recent slowdown in long-term contracts, at least as reported by Cameco. And as the inventories of US generators are dropping, they're currently below 2 years at the moment, this price-related stare-down isn't very likely to continue for that much longer. Perhaps over the next several weeks or 1 or 2 months, a bit of a break in this pricing deadlock might actually produce that new rally into the next uranium cycle. And zooming out into the global view, there are a lot of positive developments all over the world. Starting with the UK, the Prime Minister Johnson has promised to help finance the UK nuclear industry. He plans to have 25% of energy used in the UK to come from the nuclear energy, which is quite significant because that would imply nearly doubling of this percentage of energy coming from nuclear. Will that add much to the demand for uranium? I think so. Moving on to Germany, Vice Chancellor Habeck has offered to keep nuclear generators in Germany for a bit longer. Over the last few years, Germany has actually been phasing out nuclear energy. And of course, with the recent energy shortages in Europe, it's only logical that Germany is going to extend their usage of nuclear power for another several years. And in this view, the German public agrees with the government. The recent survey shows that 59% of Germans agree on keeping their nuclear generators for a while longer. You see a bit of a breakdown, a screenshot from that survey on the top right. Looking at Belgium, Belgium has also actually been phasing out of their nuclear generators over the last few years. They actually planned to stop using nuclear power completely by 2025. And what's going on right now is they plan to delay that by another 10 years, meaning that Belgium will continue using nuclear energy further into 2035. That is a very interesting development, if you ask me. Zooming to Asia, Japan shows a recent survey by Nikkei that 53% of respondents, 53% of Japanese, are actually supportive for reopening, for restarting their nuclear reactors, and only 38% are against that. This is the first time since the 2011 Fukushima where the majority of the Japanese public are actually supportive of restarting those nuclear reactors. Again, once that happens, whether it's next year or a couple of years later, that again will be a positive development for uranium prices. Looking at Korea, the new president Yoon wants 30% of Korean energy to come from nuclear. Again, that is quite a lot. But in addition to that, he also wants Korea to become a major exporter of nuclear equipment and technology. Again, all bullish signs in the longer term though. And lastly, looking at India, there are plans to build 10 nuclear generators with 700 megawatts each. And the construction of 2 of them will start next year in 2023. The construction of another 6 will start in the year after that in 2024. And another 2 will start construction in 2025. Again, over the next 2 to 3 years, the prospects for uranium prices are outstandingly promising. Let me know if you agree or disagree down in the comments below. And if you have more interesting insights on uranium industry, share them in the comments as well. Let's have a mutually beneficial exchange of ideas going on. Have a nice day. Bye bye.